The officers thought they had just made another routine arrest, but little did they know, the woman they handcuffed would soon hold their fate in her hands. The cold metal tightened around her wrists, and a strange smile crept across her face. She wasn't just any woman. They had unknowingly crossed paths with someone who could destroy everything they thought they controlled. By the time they realized their mistake, it would be too late. This wasn't just an arrest. It was the beginning of their nightmare. It was a bright afternoon in Fort Collins, Colorado. The park was lively with children playing and families enjoying picnics under oak trees. Camille, a respected attorney, sat on a bench by the pond, engrossed in her book. The peaceful scene shattered when a police cruiser screeched to a stop nearby. Two officers stepped out, their eyes immediately locking on Camille, the only person sitting alone. "Ma'am, may we speak with you for a moment?" one officer asked, his voice sharp. Camille looked up, calm as ever. "Of course. We received a report of suspicious activity." "What are you doing here?" the second officer asked, his tone dismissive. "Suspicious activity?" Camille raised an eyebrow. "I'm just sitting here reading." "Can we see some identification?" the first officer demanded. Camille's pulse quickened, but she remained composed. "What's this about?" she asked. "It's routine," the second officer muttered, though his tone said otherwise. The crowd nearby grew curious, sensing tension. Camille handed over her ID. "Is there a problem?" she asked. "Camille Johnson," the officer read aloud, his tone mocking. "What's your business here, Miss Johnson?" "I live here. I came to relax in the park," she replied, keeping her voice steady. The officer's expression hardened. "We'll see," he muttered, handed her ID back, but they didn't leave. Their questioning continued, growing more personal and probing. "Do you always carry a book like that?" one officer sneered. "Are you alone or waiting for someone?" the other added, his hand resting on his belt. Sensing the growing tension, Camille stood firm. "I'm not answering any more questions unless you tell me what I'm being accused of." The first officer stepped forward. "Don't get smart with us," he snapped. "We're just doing our job, and I know the law," Camille replied, her voice steady. "I'm not breaking it by sitting in a public park." But logic didn't seem to matter. The officer grabbed her arm, declaring, "You're resisting. What are you doing?" Camille exclaimed, startled. The crowd murmured, some recording the scene on their phones. "Stop resisting!" The officer shouted louder, the situation escalating. Handcuffed and humiliated, Camille was led to the cruiser. Her mind raced as she realized the absurdity of the situation. She had spent years defending people, and now she was the one caught in an unjust arrest. At the station, the process was degrading. Fingerprints, photographs, and being thrown into a cold, small cell. Hours later, an officer informed her that she was charged with resisting arrest and obstruction. "On what grounds?" Camille asked sharply. "You'll find out in court," he replied. After being released on bail, Camille met her friend Marissa, who was visibly concerned. Camille, still shaken, said firmly, "I'm not letting this go." That night, Camille began preparing a lawsuit against the officers and the department. The video of her arrest went viral, and the support from the community grew. Camille knew this was bigger than just her. It was a fight for justice for everyone. Camille had always fought for justice, but she never imagined she'd be arrested for a crime she didn't commit. The viral footage of her wrongful arrest spread like wildfire, sparking outrage and turning her into an unintended symbol of resistance. Determined to reclaim control of her story, Camille knew she had to fight. Not just for herself, but for others facing similar injustice. Despite the initial hesitation from her law firm, she refused to back down, explaining that this was bigger than her. The video had ignited conversations beyond the city, and Camille's quiet defiance had become a rallying cry for change. While the media clamored for interviews, Camille focused on preparing her case. She was methodical, working tirelessly to gather evidence and build a defense that would not only hold the officers accountable, but expose the deeper flaws in the system. As she prepared, The weight of the situation never left her. At night, the memory of her arrest haunted her. The cold handcuffs, the humiliation, and the crowd's murmurs. But instead of breaking her, it fueled her resolve. She knew the stakes were high, not just for her, but for countless others. Then came an unexpected twist. Camille was assigned to preside over a misconduct hearing involving the very officers who had arrested her. The irony was overwhelming, but Camille embraced it as a chance to show what true justice looked like. In the courtroom, officers Carter and Daniels were visibly shaken when they realized who would be judging them. Camille remained composed, her voice steady as she opened the session. The officers, who had once mocked her, now sat nervously, knowing their fate was in her hands. Throughout the hearing, Camille stayed professional, refusing to let personal feelings cloud her judgment. But the tension was palpable, and the officers' confidence crumbled as the case unfolded. At times, their glances betrayed remorse, as if they were starting to understand the gravity of their actions. When the gavel finally struck, ending the hearing, Camille knew the battle was far from over. But now, the system itself was under scrutiny. The officers had been stripped of their sense of untouchability, and Camille had proven that justice wasn't just about power. It was about accountability. The courtroom was packed. News of Camille presiding over the misconduct case involving her own arresting officers had spread, drawing a crowd. Some came out of curiosity, others to support her, though they knew she had to remain impartial. Camille entered with calm confidence, her robe flowing as she approached the bench. The prosecutor wasted no time, laying out the evidence against the officers, highlighting the excessive force used on Ethan, a young man caught in a routine traffic stop. "Your Honor," the prosecutor said, "this was more than a lapse in judgment. It was an abuse of power. The officers acted without regard for the law they swore to uphold." Camille listened intently, her piercing gaze making the officers fidget. The defense attorney argued that the situation had escalated, claiming the officers' actions were out of necessity, not malice. But Camille could already see through the excuses. It was all too familiar. The prosecutor called Ethan to the stand. Nervous but determined, he described how the officers had tackled him to the ground without giving him a chance to explain. They'd made up their minds before I even said a word. The cross-examination was tense, but Ethan held his ground, refusing to let the defense shake his testimony. Then came the officer's turn. Officer Carter, clearly nervous, glanced at Camille as he spoke. "I made a judgment call. At the time, I thought it was necessary. Do you still believe it was justified?" The prosecutor pressed. Carter hesitated. Looking back, no. "I could have handled it differently." His silence afterward spoke louder than any justification he could give. When Officer Daniels testified, his strained attempts to justify his actions only further highlighted their guilt. The closing arguments were stark. The prosecutor urged the court to send a clear message. Abuse of power would not be tolerated. The defense, in contrast, offered a weak plea for leniency, lacking conviction. Even the officers seemed resigned to their fate. As Camille adjourned the hearing, she knew the decision was clear. A week later, the courtroom was filled again as she prepared to deliver her ruling. "The role of law enforcement," Camille began, her voice steady, "is to protect and serve with integrity. When this responsibility is abused, it erodes public trust." She looked at the officers, their heads lowered. The evidence shows officers Carter and Daniels acted with unnecessary force, disregarding their duties. Their actions were not only unjustified, but reflective of a deeper issue. Camille's decision, mandatory suspension without pay, retraining programs, and a permanent disciplinary record. The ruling struck a balance, holding them accountable while offering the possibility of reform. As the courtroom emptied, Officer Carter hesitated at the door. "Your Honor," he murmured, "I'm sorry." Camille nodded but offered no forgiveness. Actions would speak louder than apologies. Later that evening, Camille attended a community meeting. The room was filled with people eager to share their stories and frustrations. An older woman approached her, voice trembling with emotion. "Thank you," she said. "What you did means everything." Camille smiled softly. "This is just the beginning. There's still work to be done." In the days that followed, the case sparked real conversations between activists, law enforcement, and community leaders. Camille pushed for reforms, advocating for transparency and accountability. The case had become more than a ruling. It ignited a movement for change. Standing on the courthouse steps one afternoon, watching a group of young activists rallying, Camille felt a sense of hope. Change was slow, but it was happening. If you believe in accountability and change, subscribe to our channel for more stories that inspire action. Together, we can make a difference.